All right, everybody. So we've had a long night and a long day, but we're back here for some budget language that has to do with pensions. So welcome to a bonus session of the House Committee on Government Operations, Military Affairs. So I think there are really two kind of separate but pension-related pieces of language that Chris is going to walk us through. There are three documents up on our committee website, today's date under Chris's name. I think we're starting with the one that is the contributions document. Chris, welcome.
Thank you. For the record, Chris Rook, Joint Fiscal. The chair asked me to give you all a drive-by of some language that is proposed for inclusion in the House's version of the big bill that they're trying to finalize in the next hour or two. So there's really two items that are both posted on the website. I'm going to start with the document about the teacher retirement system contributions made for active members. A little bit of backstory on where this came from. Last year, there was in 2021, there was a pension task force that was convened that met almost 20 times for almost a year and came up with a lot of recommendations that you all enacted in Act 114 last year. One of the loose ends in that legislation was there was originally envisioned to be a progressive contribution structure for active teachers that would be phased in over a 3-year period. And it would work similarly to an income tax where, there would be several brackets and where your income fell within those brackets, you'd pay a different marginal rate. Subsequent to that being proposed, there were concerns raised by school business officers about the administrative feasibility of implementing a system like that could involve a customized contribution rate for almost every member. So where the language that ended up in Act 114 landed was for FY23 and FY24, there'd be an alternative rate structure that's sort of a tiered structure that is similar in concept to a progressive structure, but it's a lot easier to administer than the originally envisioned marginal rate. And I believe it had 8 brackets. So where your base salary fell determined which rate would apply to your full earnings for the year. So there was that alternative construct put in place for those 2 years, but for FY25 and later, the original progressive marginal structure was still in law. And Act 114 asked the school business officers and the treasurer's office to put a report together and say, hey, what's your recommendation moving forward? Is this still going to work as originally envisioned or not? That report is on the legislative website back in January, and its recommendation was that the marginal structure that was originally recommended is going to be a little too administratively difficult, and they recommended staying with the existing tiered structure that was in place, but with adjusted rates for FY25 and beyond that yield the same amount of revenue that we thought the original structure would do. So what you are looking at here is the legislation that would be needed to implement the rates that are shown on the chart of my very first document. You will see that subsequent to the preliminary analysis that was done for the task force, actuaries reran the numbers to get us to the same roughly $10 million of above base revenue that was anticipated. And these rates that are 5 to 10 basis points higher than the FY24 rates yield that revenue. So it is a relatively small increase from the rates that are in place in FY24 and still yield the same amount of revenue that was originally envisioned. And that revenue goes toward the normal cost of teachers' retirement benefits. So every dollar that's paid in through an active teacher's contributions is a dollar that otherwise would have to be paid out of the education fund. Are there any questions?
I have a couple, just clarifying. So my understanding is that this slightly increases the rate for each tier and extends essentially the mechanism that we've been using as a workaround for one additional fiscal year.
That's exactly right. It actually makes the workaround the permanent status going forward, just with a slightly tweaked rate.
And so so that was my second question. So for the future, it's just this rate until somebody changes the statute. So these rates in the third column, if this is adapted in budget, those are the rates
Correct.
going forward until the legislature changes them.
Correct. The language that you would see on the third page says beginning on July 1, 2024. So this would be, until the legislature says otherwise, this would be the rates in place for FY25 and beyond.
Any other questions about the contribution rates?
All right, let's pivot over to the next question real quick. This one is a little slightly more complicated, but this has to do with cost of living adjustments for retired members of the teacher retirement system.
We have the committee look at the methodology chart.
Sure, that's a great first place. So this is a good example to walk you through. You go back to algebra, the order of operations, that's sort of what's at play here. Teachers, retired teachers and their beneficiaries receive automatic cost of living adjustments. The statute calls them post-retirement adjustments to retirement allowance, because we'd like to make things complicated here, that are based on the year-over-year change in the consumer price index, the CPI. Before 2016, for most teacher members, their benefit, their COLA, is based at 50% of the net percentage change in that CPI from year to year. Before 2016, there was a statutory maximum of 5% that applied to the size of the COLA itself. In the, let's just make things really confusing, Act 114 of 2016, which had nothing to do with the task force last year, but was the miscellaneous retirement bill 7 years ago, made some changes to how the COLA was calculated. And it applied the 5% statutory maximum, not to the size of the COLA, but to the size of the net change in the CPI that's used to calculate the COLA. It's a lot of words to try to spell out what this little chart tries to summarize. So the actual CPI change last year was 7.6%. So under the current law, you apply the 5% statutory max to that net percentage change, then take 50% of that. So you would arrive at a COLA of 2.5%. Under the old law, the order of operations changed. So the 5% maximum didn't apply to the net percentage change. It applied to the size of the COLA itself. Under that former calculation, it would have resulted in a COLA of 3.8%. How you calculate this only makes a material difference when the CPI is above that statutory maximum of 5%. And last year was the first time it happened in over 30 years. So there's been a lot of discussions with the NEA, with the Treasurer's Office, with legislative leadership, and with other stakeholders to find a path forward for this year to resolve this issue. And you'll see that in the language in the third document under my name. So at a high level, what this language does is would stipulate that the retired members and beneficiaries of the V-STIR system, the teacher system, would receive a one-time supplemental payment this calendar year of the dollar equivalent of that delta between getting a 3.8 and a 2.5% COLA. That would be a one-time payment. It's not factored into sort of the base moving forward. The cost of that would be just over $2.8 million. This language does contain a $3 million education fund, one-time appropriation to the system to make that payment, to provide a slight cushion for margin of error just based on the timing of when the calculations are run to make sure they have enough money to make that payment. There is also language in here that clearly states the legislature's intent that we are right on the cusp of the next experience study happening. The next experience study is to happen at the end of FY23. When that happens, that's when most of the actuarial assumptions are trued up. So, your assumed rate of return, your long-term demographic assumptions, your long-term inflation assumption, all that gets trued up, and it's happening like in the very near future. So what this language says is it's the legislature's intent, or the legislature would be appropriating $3 million from the Ed Fund to make this one-time payment for that delta in calendar 23. There's language in here that says if the actuarial valuations for FY23, which won't be ready until the fall, show that a similar situation, inflation was high enough to cause another situation next year, that would be a similar payment would be made next year upon the appropriations occurring in the BAA to pay for it. And there's language in here that directs the state treasurer to cost out, once the assumptions are revised after this experience study, what the cost would be of reverting this law back to the way it was pre-2016. There's another provision in here that states that it's the legislature's intent that as part of changing that law, the present value of any additional cost associated with changing that law would be fully funded up front so as not to increase the unfunded liability of the retirement system.
Representative Hoover.
Is there anything in the language that basically says the treasurer's office or any other entity can't monkey with the experience studies recommendations? Because we got into the thing on the state retirement plan because the actuary recommended an assumed rate of return of X and somebody forced it down to Y.
There's nothing in here that states that, but I would note that the responsibility for adopting the revised assumptions rests with the, depending on which assumptions they are, rests with the respective retirement boards as well as with VPIC. And when you all passed Act 75 2 years ago, VPIC now has the exclusive power to adopt any changes to the assumed rate of return or to some of the economic assumptions. But there's nothing in this language that changes who has those roles and responsibilities for making those decisions. I think the intent here was to make sure that since we're right on the cusp of revising assumptions potentially, that the cost for making a change to the law reflects the best available information and doesn't rely on assumptions that might prove to be stale.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I just don't want to see what happened before it happened again, where the actuary was firm in their recommendation for something and it was not necessarily ignored, maybe enhanced is the better characterization.
So would it be fair to characterize this for the uninitiated by the last biennium's pension discussion that a straight reading of many of the documents that people would have seen saying, you know, a normal increase in the cost of living adjustment would be half of CPI, that many retired teachers were expecting to get a 3.8% increase, but got a 2.5% increase. And this one-time appropriation would allow us to deliver that in light of the higher than historic first in 30 years inflation from the last year for this year. Mm-hmm. And then we're looking at the experience ratings into the future to determine whether we want to make one-time changes only so that we're not rebasing everything with a new formula, or what the cost of just changing the formula and taking the upside risk of high inflation years would be.
Yeah, I think that's generally fair. I would just put a little twist or a little, expound a little bit and say that I think the intent here is clear that the legislature aims to change the law moving forward assuming that it fully funds the present value of the cost associated with doing that. I don't think there's intent here to do sort of one-offs in perpetuity. But one thing I'd mention is I could see why people would be confused about the COLA benefit because there is a lot of nuance in the way the law is worded that is probably lost on the average person who doesn't live in Title 16 all the time. And, this is really the first time that inflation has been high enough in 3 decades to make a material difference. So,
well, and the primary concern when Act 114 or 2016 happened was when there were deflationary years.
That's exactly right.
Get a lower pension payment in the following year.
That's exactly right. It was meant to hold retirees harmless, so their benefit wouldn't go down if there was negative CPI back then.
Representative Hooper.
So what's the saving on doing it this way long-term for the plan?
So that is a really good question, and I don't think we know long-term for the plan because, you can cost out the impact of sort of changing the law retroactively based on the current assumptions. But what we don't know is how the assumptions will change in the future and what our experience is going to look like moving forward. Because inflation, as you know, Representative Hooper, has been a very large deviation from assumptions the last few years. And I think the actual cost of this will depend on how much actual inflation varies from our long-term assumptions and what those assumptions might be after the experience study.
So let me make sure I'm understanding what I think I understand from what I just read. It's a quote unquote bonus for the amount that is between the 2.5 and the 3.8.
Right.
So it's not then compounded year
Correct.
after year so effectively you're getting the cash, but you're not getting the benefit of the cash.
That's right. And one thing I would note is, I mean, the scenario where making a change would sort of add risk or cost, if you will, in the future is if inflation is above, it persists above those statutory maximums. So inflation is starting to come down this year. I think the February CPI value is 6%. So it's getting a little closer to 5 than to 8. Let's just would and hope it looks like that for the rest of the year and keeps on that path. But this changing the law in this respect really only makes a material difference if inflation persists higher than that statutory maximum level.
Well, and with an increase in 25 basis points after a couple of bank runs, you know, sort of seems like we're in unpredictable waters. Yeah. Thank you very much, Chris. Any final thoughts to ask Chris before we hear from stakeholders? All right. Mr. Fannin, would you like to take the witness chair? And if you want to bring anybody up with you, happy to.
Warren Buffett.
Warren Buffett, yes. That would be nice. Good afternoon. I know we stand between you and the weekend, so we'll try to move right along here. Jeff Fannin, Executive Director of Vermont NEA, thank you for having me and to discuss the two issues, one being the marginal rates that Chris discussed. And we are comfortable with going to the banded rates. As we know, Act 114 made a lot of changes. We heard a lot from the school business officers and some of the difficulties they had realizing the operational side of this is important. We agreed with the sticking with the banded rates going forward. It makes a whole lot of sense at this point, and away we go there. So if that's any consolation, we think that's a good move at this point. Perhaps in the future, we'll have better systems in place. We can go to a different rate, but that's hopefully long in the future. It was a 114 we got to as we did. As to the COLA, the cost of living adjustment that Chris just discussed, it's been a long history as well. So starting in 2016, change in law that everybody knew was designed to protect teachers in a negative inflationary environment. It's hard to think of that today, but the some substance of the testimony back in House Gov.Ops in 2016, which was then chaired by a retired teacher, Donna Swaney. Also on the committee was retired teacher Maida Townsend, who later became chair of House Gov.Ops. Did not include any conversation about upside inflationary pressures that might have been down the road. Well, here we are. We found out some language does need to be cleaned up in the bill, or excuse me, in the law. But in the meantime, I wouldn't call it a bonus, Representative Hooper. I would call it just giving retired teachers what they were promised and what they thought they were going to get, which is at the 3.8. So we've just seen that as a one-time payment to them and understanding that we have some more work to do to fix up going forward, knowing that the experience study is coming in this year and trying to figure out how much that will adjust the ADEC, the actuarially determined employer contribution, the state's contribution. And so working with the actuaries to figure out that number. So that's still in progress, I would say. And we hope to have that soon, but the actuaries do their work as they will in the time frame in which they operate. And so we're trying to work through this. So the important thing is we think the language right now says what we need it to say to move it along. And we think that's important. So Vermont NEA does support the language that's in the draft that Chris presented to you.
Well, thank you. I know there were a lot of conversations out of this room that let us get to a place where we could address the immediate issue with the two different interpretations of the order of operations as Chris described it, and the way the calculation did without having instantaneous impact on the ADEC. And so appreciate the collaboration and trying to take this step, one step at a time.
Correct. Thank you.
So anything else we should know before we kind of give a signal to our colleagues across the hall?
No, not from Vermont and East perspective. I don't know if the treasurer's office wants to say something, but.
Does anybody on the committee? Yeah, go ahead.
No, to clarify, when I say bonus, it's because as the normal rate is going to climb because it was a bonus, it's going to take a dip and then extrapolate further from that because your supplemental payment is not going to be figured in the COLA percentage enhancements in the future.
That is true today, yes.
Yeah.
Understand that, yes. But also know that we're working to try to figure out how to go back to what I would call pre-2016 language and understanding in statute and what the promises that were made to retired teachers, or active teachers and then retired teachers.
If we weren't live, I might call it something else.
Well, thanks for coming.
Thank you all. Thanks for giving up your Friday to hear this.
We're still going to get out of here relatively early, I think. Did the treasurer's office have any additional comments? Anybody wants to make? All right. So committee. So we've got two pieces here, the banded contribution rates and the pension language. Can we take those as one sort of signal over that we're supportive of including these two things in the budget that are in our jurisdiction? All right, I'll take that as let's see, we're missing 3, so we're 903 on a straw poll. Okay, I really appreciate everybody coming back after all the work we've done on the floor. I will see you all back here on Tuesday afternoon. We don't have anything in the morning on Tuesday, which is our normal practice. So thank you all. Have a restful, wonderful weekend.